Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Weeb Union, and in this one we have several developments across the front line where the Russians have retaken the initiative in the eastern front, and the Ukrainians are continuing the offensive operations in the Kursk direction. Starting out in the Kherson region, we see that the Russians have crossed over the bridge here in the central islands in between the Ukrainian side and the Russian side, but have managed to capture this section of one of the island Dachas, which is a island vacation home area where the Ukrainians have had positions here since they recaptured Kherson 2 years ago, and now the Russians are doing some positional fighting here in the islands, capturing this section of the front line, potentially looking to gain full control over the island to improve their positions for either offensive or defensive battles. Further east here in the direction of Krasnohorivka, the Russians have captured the majority of the city, leaving only about 5% remaining in Ukrainian hands. The Russians have managed to capture the northern parts of the city, as well as some fields and roads in between that of the city itself and the Ukrainian withdrawal. At the same time, they also pushed in the western direction to the Losova River and along the western parts of the city. The Russian objective here is twofold. They wanted to connect the southern side by Krasnohorivka with the northern side to gain control over the entire area in between that of the Vovcha River line and the current front line. At the same time, they're looking to flank the Ukrainian withdrawal by advancing along the river line in the southern bank and potentially crossing to the northern bank as well, where the objective would be to reach the Vovcha River line and cut off any Ukrainian withdrawal along the river line. However, the Ukrainians do have a lot of positions here in the south which could stop any sort of Russian advance. This means the Ukrainians have sent forces to secure the flank as they withdraw from the pocket here to the north of Krasnohorivka. But as expected, the Russians will gain full control over the entire gap in between the Russian front line and the Vovcha River line here to the west, which will lead to the Russians gaining full control over this area here with the river line to the south and the entire open area with fields and fortified positions in the northeast will fall under Russian control due to this withdrawal. At the same time, we see here to the northwest in the direction of Ukrainsk, the Russians are storming the town from both the east and the south. Ukrainsk has a lot of high-rise apartment complexes. There's also this mine just right next to it, which is a high ground overview. It is at the bottom of the fortified positions here along the Pokrovsk section of the front line. This means that the Russian objective here is to gain full control over the town, the high ground, and the fortified positions right next to it. There are reports that the Russians are also flanking towards the mine area here in between Ukrainsk in the north and Khirnik in the south. So we see heavy fighting taking place here in this direction, where the Russians are using this breakthrough as an opportunity to flank the Ukrainian positions from the south and from the north, to then also push into the direction of the mine area, which would allow the Russians to expand the front line here in the southern flank. And while the majority of the Ukrainian forces have been sent to Selydove to stabilize the front, the Russians regained the initiative and managed to regain positions within the parts of the town which is located in the north. This is due to the Russian control over the mine area here in the northeastern parts of the town, which allow them to have a strong position with the high ground, and they have taken advantage of that to regain some of these positions within Selydove, as it is a very strong position to have, and they are looking to re-enter Selydove and regain positions towards the central parts of the town. So we see heavy fighting taking place within Selydove with the new Ukrainian reinforcements introduced, but the Russians are attempting to regain the initiative as quickly as they lost it. So we see that the Russians, with these three advances, are advancing in three sections of the front line, all facing in the southern direction. The Ukrainians have also sent reinforcements in the direction of Krasnohorivka and the general vicinity of Pokrovsk, which has stabilized the front line for the Ukrainians, which has led to no Russian advances compared to the southern parts, Similar to Selydove, where the Ukrainians managed to recapture positions with their reinforcements, but the Russians are now regaining the initiative. We see some of the geolocated footage here in the direction of Selydove, where the Russians attempted a landing in Mikhailivka, the dacha area between that and Selydove, after which the Ukrainians struck them with targeted fire, which hit both the infantry and the vehicle. The Ukrainians sent an infantry fighting vehicle to clean up the strike to make sure if there were any survivors to get them as well. So we see that the Ukrainians are effectively launching these counterattacks with the fresh units, which is exactly what allowed them to recapture this territory. The Russians had so far only met with ample resistance here in the Pokrovsk section of the front line. Over the past month, the Russians managed to capture a large margin of territory, including heavily fortified positions, almost entirely without a fight. While the Ukrainians now have sent reinforcements, they are mainly focusing on armored vehicles and FPV drones, which they have been using a lot more. They also sent additional artillery to this section of the front line, which the soldiers fighting here had been complaining they were significantly lacking of. Therefore, we see that the Ukrainians have been able to somewhat stabilize the front, but the Russians are attempting to regain the initiative. The initial shock phase is over. Now the Russians are trying to regain the initiative, push the Ukrainians back, and adapt it to the new fighting style. In the direction of New York, a similar case happened, where the reinforcements here was yet another Azov Brigade, possibly the third Azov Brigade, I'm not really sure, as there has been no dates on which it is, it just says the Azov Brigade. But they arrived and had a lot of FPV drone launches, as we see with this geolocated footage. Every single one of these flags was another point at which the Azov Brigade was launching FPV drones at Russian positions, both in Selydove and New York. Since then, the Ukrainians have managed to regain the link between the industrial zone and Selydove. However, since then, the Russians have restarted counterattacks in this direction. It is unclear exactly how much they control, but the gray zone has significantly expanded. It seems the siege of the industrial zone continues, and the Ukrainians have not broken the siege yet. They have simply temporary relief of the soldiers. However, the Russians are already on the counterattack to regain positions. And this is exactly the current position in the front line, and that is that the Ukrainians are running down low on reserves. They cannot send enough to engage in proper counterattacks, so they do some local ones to re-establish positions or to strengthen their positions just to slow down the Russian advance rather than turning the tide. There's no objective of the Ukrainians right now to turn the tide in the Donetsk region, it is simply to slow them down. However, it is reported that these forces were relocated from the Volodar section of the front line, as well as the Kupiansk section of the front line, which has led to the Russian capture of Prichistivka in the south and the Russian capture of Synkivka in the north, where the Russians, for the first time in almost 2 years, or possibly longer than that, have regained control over Synkivka, and this opens the road for Petropavlivka, which is on just the outskirts of Kupiansk. At the same time, we saw some fighting in the Peshani direction. The Ukrainians are attempting to recapture Tabaivka. However, there's been no updates on this counterattack since the initial gains. Therefore, we see that the Russians have gained the initiative in the Donetsk region of the front line, where offensive operations continue, and they're doing positional fighting in everywhere else across the front line, where the Ukrainians are leaving gaps in their defense due to the Kursk offensive and the defense of Donetsk, where the Russians have made significant advances. In the Kursk direction, the Ukrainians have managed to advance in two parts, both to gain control over the village of Naidenov here in the east of the railway, as well as to the northwest, where they're fighting in the direction of Kherson. Therefore, we see that the Russians and the Ukrainians are still fighting heavily over this section of the front line. The Russians recently counterattacked to regain some positions, but the Ukrainians are not stopping there and continue their own offensive operations. Based on this, we see that the Ukrainians continue their Kursk offensive, and their support and defensive reinforcements arriving in the Pokrovsk section of the front line does not come from the reserves fighting in the Kursk region. I misjudged that. Instead, they arrived from other sections of the front line in the south and in the east. So the Ukrainians are completely prioritizing the Kursk offensive over the eastern and southern fronts. They are instead relocating troops from the southern and eastern front around the front line to plug the gaps, but this just leaves new gaps in the defense. And that's going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.